What if I told you the man who literally saved the United States from tearing itself apart almost didn't even get the job? History books love to make Abraham Lincoln's destiny look inevitable. But honestly, the reality was absolute utter chaos.
Just 40%. That's it. In the insanely explosive election of 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidency with barely 39.7% of the popular vote. He wasn't this beloved national icon yet. He was a complete political outsider who'd actually just suffered a stinging defeat for the U.S. Senate barely 2 years prior.
Part 1. The Accidental President.
So how exactly does a supposed political loser stumble right into the Oval Office during the most fractured moment in American history? Well, his opponents basically got into a massive brawl over the steering wheel of the country. The Democrats ended up splitting their 60% of the vote among 3 different candidates. They completely paved the way for Lincoln to just drive right past them and park at the White House.
But here's the thing. Lincoln's shock victory was the exact spark that ignited decades of simmering tension. By 1860, the United States was essentially 2 totally different countries just sharing one border. You had an industrializing, urbanizing North clashing head-on against an agricultural South that was deeply, deeply reliant on a cotton economy fueled by slavery. So the second Lincoln won, the Deep South panicked, and South Carolina immediately seceded.
Part 2. From Backwoods to Bar. Now, to really grasp how Lincoln handled a country that was literally tearing itself apart, we've got to look at his incredibly obscure origins. It is wildly improbable that the guy who became one of the greatest orators in human history had about 1 cumulative year of formal schooling.
Yep, that's it.
He was entirely self-taught, escaping a really harsh, isolated frontier life by just devouring absolutely every single book he could get his hands on.
But that brilliant mind carried a tremendous, heavy weight. Lincoln suffered severely from what 19th century doctors called melancholy, which we'd recognize today as clinical depression. It's a really heartbreaking contrast, right? Leading a fractured nation in public while privately wrestling with these periods of intense, overwhelming personal darkness.
And Abraham Lincoln wasn't forged by easy victories either. He faced a staggering lifetime of loss. He lost his mother to poison when he was just a boy, his sister shortly after, and unimaginably, 3 of his 4 sons died in childhood. Surviving that relentless personal tragedy, on top of major political failures, it built him into a man of almost superhuman resilience.
Part 3. A House Divided. That resilience, it was about to be tested on a massive national scale in the 1850s. Right in the middle of the boiling tension over expanding slavery into the new Western territories, Lincoln delivered an absolutely explosive quote. "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He knew compromise was dead. The nation was eventually going to have to become all one thing or all the other. And that powerful metaphor is what launched him straight into the national spotlight.
And then the powder keg finally blew. April 12, 1861. Confederate batteries opened fire on a Union garrison trapped in Fort Sumter, South Carolina. Barely a month after Lincoln's inauguration, the American Civil War had officially begun.
Lincoln's response was immediate, and it was aggressive. Within days, he called up a massive militia of 75,000 men. To him, the Confederacy wasn't some legitimate new country. They were armed rebels committing treason, and he fully intended to crush them fast.
But that aggressive move completely backfired. This massive call to arms absolutely terrified the neutral border states. Virginia and the Upper South immediately bolted and joined the Confederacy. Suddenly, the rebel capital moved to Richmond, Virginia, which was dangerously close to Lincoln's front door. Any hope for a quick victory just vanished.
Part 4. The Emancipator's Gamble.
We are now entering the absolute darkest days of the conflict. Lincoln was losing badly on the battlefield, but his biggest problem was actually this. How do you win a war when your generals refuse to fight? Take General George McClellan. Think of him like a brilliant football coach who recruited a fantastic team, trained them to absolute perfection, but was utterly terrified to actually let them walk onto the field against the rival team. With the Union suffering brutal, bloody defeats, his generals constantly stalling, and global superpowers like Britain actually threatening to jump in and aid the Confederacy just to protect their cotton supply, Lincoln hit a breaking point. The old strategies were dead. He realized he had to fundamentally change the entire purpose of the war.
The political genius of what he did next is just incredible. He drafted the Emancipation Proclamation, but he kept it totally secret until a Union victory at Antietam, just so he wouldn't look desperate. And he brilliantly framed freeing enslaved people not just as a moral good, but as a strict military necessity. This authorized the recruitment of African American soldiers and brought a devastating wave of new power to the Union Army.
Part 5. Turning the Tide.
272 words. That's all it took. By 1863, the American Civil War had reached its absolute boiling point. Following the blood-soaked Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, Lincoln was invited to say a few words at a cemetery dedication. In a speech that lasted barely 2 minutes, he completely redefined the American purpose.
That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. With those exact words at Gettysburg, Lincoln literally shifted the goalposts of history. The war was no longer just some mechanical effort to save the Union. It was now a profound moral crusade to fulfill the original promise of the Declaration of Independence.
Part 6. A New Birth of Freedom.
Entering the final act, Lincoln finally finds a general who isn't afraid to fight, Ulysses S. Grant. Together, they relentlessly grind down Robert E. Lee's army, while General Sherman launches this brutal, devastating march right through the South. This overwhelming military momentum practically hands Lincoln his re-election in 1864, and by April 1865, Lee finally surrenders. The Union is saved.
But you have to remember, Lincoln wasn't just fighting a war on the battlefield. He was fighting in the halls of power, too. Before the war even officially ended, he used every single ounce of his immense political leverage to ram the 13th Amendment through Congress, permanently outlawing slavery in the Constitution. He essentially cured the root cause of the war before the fighting even stopped.
Picture that stoic marble giant sitting in the Lincoln Memorial, the legendary great emancipator, right? Well, what if I told you that before the history books, before the massive monuments, the man who saved the United States was, well, entirely broken?
Listen to this. I am now the most miserable man living. Does that sound like the fiery rhetoric of a triumphant leader? Definitely not. That is a direct quote from the Journal of a Man absolutely crushed by life. Back in the 1830s, long before he ever saw the White House, Abraham Lincoln was completely flat broke, dealing with severe crippling depression, and honestly, at one point, he couldn't even bring himself to leave his bed for days.
It is just such an insane contrast. How on earth did this outcast, a guy who rolled into town alone without a single dollar to his name, transform into the only leader capable of saving a nation at war with itself? Let's dive into this explainer and explore the grueling 24-year crucible that literally forged an American icon. Section 1. The Penniless Roommate. 1837. Springfield.
So Springfield, Illinois, back in 1837, was definitely not some polished capital city. It was a rough, muddy frontier town. We're talking unpaved roads and literally hogs roaming the streets. And before Lincoln arrived, he was the ultimate hustler, just trying to scrape by. He worked as a carpenter, a postmaster, a soldier, a surveyor, you name it. But despite grinding away at all these jobs, he rode into town with every single thing he owned stuffed into just 2 saddlebags.
$17. Now, that was the cost of a basic, no-frills single bed, a mattress, and some sheets at the local general store. And Lincoln? He couldn't even afford that. He was completely, utterly strapped for cash. The store's owner actually noted that when Lincoln realized he couldn't even afford a place to sleep, his voice was just overwhelmingly melancholy, and his face was the gloomiest he had ever seen.
Well, that store owner was a guy named Joshua Speed. And he actually felt so terrible for this towering, gloomy young man that he offered Lincoln a way out of the debt entirely, a free spot in the room right above his store. It's a brilliant example of the ripple effect of a single act of kindness, because that one simple gesture sparked a lifelong friendship that quite literally kept a roof over the future president's head and let him finally put down roots in Springfield.
Section 2. Love, Law, and Tragedy. Building a Life.
So with a roof over his head, Lincoln secures a job as a junior law partner, and he starts developing that famous down-home, common-sense style of his. But his personal life was kind of empty. That is, until Mary Todd entered the picture in 1839. Now, she came from a very wealthy political family, and her sister actually thought Lincoln was a terrible match. He had no money, came from nothing. But Mary, she saw right past that folksy exterior. She saw his fierce ambition, his sharp intelligence, and this really innate understanding of raw political power. They eventually marry, buy this modest little cottage for $1,500 and start a family. But providing for them, that took some seriously grueling work. Lincoln wasn't just sitting comfortably in an office. He was a circuit-riding attorney on the 8th Judicial Circuit. He'd travel from town to town across central Illinois, completely vanishing for 3 agonizing months at a time, twice a year. And that meant Mary was left entirely alone to run the house and raise their young boys.
Eventually, his ambition pushes him into a seat in the U.S. Congress, taking him all the way to Washington. But the Capitol wasn't exactly a great place for a young family back then, so he sent Mary and the boys back to Kentucky while he got to work. The separation was really tough on him. He wrote this incredibly heartfelt letter home, basically admitting that without his family around, all his intense political business had just grown exceedingly tasteless to him.
After just one term, feeling like he hadn't made much of a dent, Lincoln comes home and just buries himself in his legal work. But then unimaginable heartbreak hits. Their rambunctious 3-year-old son, Eddie, catches tuberculosis. For 52 agonizing days, this little boy struggled and sweated, and on the 53rd day, he passed away. They held the funeral right there in the Lincoln home, and it just left Abraham and Mary absolutely totally devastated.
Section 3. The Spark of Outrage. The 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Following Eddie's death, Lincoln became this highly sought-after attorney, and he seemed to be entirely done with politics. But a massive political earthquake was brewing. See, for decades, the Missouri Compromise of 1820 had acted as a sort of stopgap, keeping northern territories free from slavery. But the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act changed literally everything. It introduced this idea of popular sovereignty, meaning any new territory could just vote on whether to become a free or slave state. It completely tore up the old compromise. Suddenly, slavery could potentially spread all the way up to Canada.
Lincoln was fundamentally, deeply outraged by this. He firmly believed that if new territories could simply choose to be slave states, the entire country would inevitably tip toward slavery. He just couldn't sit on the sidelines anymore. So he completely abandoned his comfortable, lucrative law practice, hit the road, and started delivering these absolutely fierce speeches against this new act.
Section 4. A House Divided. The Fight for the Nation's Soul.
America was slowly tearing itself apart, and Lincoln stepped right into the crossfire. His political comeback was incredibly fast and incredibly high stakes. In 1854, he actually stepped down in a Senate race, strategically sacrificing his own lead just to make sure another anti-slavery candidate won. By 1858, he's challenging the powerful author of the Kansas-Nebraska Act himself, Senator Stephen A. Douglas. And then by 1860, this absolutely brilliant speech at New York's Cooper Union turns a totally skeptical crowd into cheering fans, officially securing him the Republican presidential nomination.
It was actually during this rapid rise that he delivered his legendary warning to the Illinois State House. He boldly declared that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Now, he didn't expect the Union to be dissolved or the House to fall, but he knew with absolute certainty that the nation would eventually stop being divided. It would have to become all one thing or all the other.
His 7 debates with Douglas practically set the prairies on fire. Douglas was out there openly arguing that the government was made strictly by white men for white men, basically declaring that black people should never be citizens. And Lincoln fired right back, using the Declaration of Independence. He fiercely defended the idea that the authors intended to include all men in the inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Make no mistake, this was a battle for the very soul of the country.
Now, right in the middle of this intense, heavy national crisis, there's actually a pretty surprising, lighthearted fact about his campaign. Lincoln, who was known as the hard-working rail splitter, got a letter from an 11-year-old girl named Grace Bedell. She basically told him, hey, all the ladies like whiskers, and if you grow a beard, they'll totally tease their husbands into voting for you. And just like that, literally right before the election, the most iconic facial hair in American history was born. The strategy, the speeches, the debates, it all worked. Late at night, the returns finally came in, and a native son of Springfield had won the presidency. But man, the celebration was incredibly short-lived. The fallout was instantaneous and severe. Just 6 weeks after his election victory, the very first state seceded from the Union. The nation was literally falling apart while he was still packing his bags.
Section 5. The Final Farewell. Leaving Springfield Behind. The pressure on the president-elect right then was just immense. People were begging him to compromise with the South, to just give in on the slavery issue to save the Union. But he held his ground. Yet, the day before he left his home of 24 years, he showed this deeply touching sense of optimism.
He walked into his old law office and told his partner, Herndon, to leave their firm's sign hanging up. He firmly believed that after his presidency, he'd come right back to Springfield and practice law as if nothing had ever happened.
The next morning, just before 8 a.m., a crowd gathered at the Great Western Railroad station. With his voice literally cracking with emotion, Lincoln paid tribute to the town that had transformed him from a young man to an old man. He delivered this heavy, emotional farewell to the gathered crowd, fully acknowledging that he was heading off to face a task even greater than the one that rested upon George Washington himself.
Picture this. It's 1861 and the air is practically humming with tension. A young America isn't just fractured, it is actively tearing itself apart. The grand democratic experiment is teetering on the absolute brink of self-destruction. I mean, the stakes literally could not be higher. And the guy stepping into the absolute center of this unprecedented crisis, the man tasked with saving the entire nation, he had less than 1 total year of formal education. It's a staggering fact, isn't it? How does a self-taught frontier kid who grew up on dirt floors navigate the most catastrophic political and military crisis in U.S. history? How on earth does he prevent the total collapse of the country? Well, that is exactly the undeniable mystery we're diving into in today's Explainer. So, let's set the scene. When Abraham Lincoln took the oath of office in March of 1861, he basically inherited the most impossible job on the planet. The country wasn't just having a heated political debate. The actual bonds of the Union were snapping. He had to steer a nation that was entirely consumed by the volatile moral and economic weight of slavery. Just look at the terrifying reality he faced before he even had a chance to unpack his bags. 7 southern states, already seceded. Federal forts and arsenals were actively being seized. And then, the spark. Fort Sumter gets bombarded for 30 straight hours. The American Civil War officially begins. Lincoln literally has to build a war machine from scratch just to fight his own countrymen. But to really understand how he survived this firestorm, we've got to look backward for a second. There is this massive, dramatic contrast between the White House and his origins. Lincoln was born into the raw, unyielding American frontier. We're not talking about a childhood of elegant parlors here. This was an elemental existence, chopping wood, bitter winters, and sheer unfiltered survival. His trajectory is just unbelievable. He goes from a Kentucky log cabin in 1809 to navigating flatboats down the Mississippi in 1828 to arriving in New Salem, Illinois in 1831 with basically nothing. He survived grueling physical labor, the tragic early death of his mother, extreme poverty, you name it. His secret weapon through all of it? An insatiable hunger for borrowed books. He quite literally taught himself the law by reading by firelight. Okay, flash forward a bit. He's practicing law, keeping his head down, but then everything shatters in 1854. The Kansas-Nebraska Act hits like a political earthquake. It essentially allowed new Western territories to just vote on whether to allow slavery, wiping out all the previous compromises. For Lincoln, this wasn't just a bad policy decision, it was a profound moral outrage, and it pulled him right back onto the public stage. And this outrage sets up the legendary 1858 debates. On one side, you have Stephen Douglas arguing for popular sovereignty, basically letting locals vote on slavery, treating it like it's just another zoning ordinance. Against him, Lincoln brings this unyielding moral clarity. He argues that slavery is a fundamental wrong, and while he said he wouldn't touch it where it already existed, he absolutely refused to let it expand 1 single inch further. Now, here is where the math gets absolutely fascinating. Lincoln actually won the 1860 presidency with only 40% of the popular vote. It was a deeply fractured 4-way race. And get this, he didn't carry a single Southern state. In 10 states, his name wasn't even on the ballot. That victory was the ultimate trigger for Southern secession. So Lincoln wins, and instantly he's thrust into the absolute meat grinder of war. Those early years were agonizing. The Union suffered devastating, bloody defeats at places like Bull Run. And remember, Lincoln had virtually no military background. He spent his nights poring over strategy books, desperately searching for aggressive generals who would actually take the fight to the enemy. Which leads to this incredible piece of dark humor. Lincoln was pulling his hair out over his top commander at the time, General George McClellan. Now, McClellan was great at training troops, sure, but he was terrified to actually use them in battle. He was constantly demanding more men, more time. Lincoln's frustration finally boiled over, and he quipped that managing McClellan's army was literally like shoveling fleas across a barnyard. But amidst all this chaos, Lincoln's understanding of the war was evolving. On January 1st, 1863, he issues the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, let's separate the myth from the reality here for a second. It didn't free everyone instantly. It was a very precise military measure enacted by the commander-in-chief, specifically freeing enslaved people in rebellious states. But its impact? Seismic. It legally transformed the war from a fight over territory into a crusade for human liberty. That evolving moral purpose set the stage for arguably the most pivotal summer of the 19th century, July 1863. For 2 years, the Union had been taking an absolute beating. But within the span of just a few days, the entire strategic balance of the American Civil War completely flipped. It was a spectacular 1-2 punch. First, you've got the massive Union victory at Gettysburg in the east, which stopped the Confederate invasion dead in its tracks and crippled their offensive power. Second, Ulysses S. Grant finally captures Vicksburg in the west. That victory gave the Union total control of the Mississippi River, literally slicing the Confederacy in half. But what happens just a few months later is even more incredible. Standing right there on the blood-soaked ground of Gettysburg, Lincoln delivered a speech that was just 272 words long. Think about that. In just a couple of minutes, he connected the sacrifice of those soldiers to a new birth of freedom, ensuring that government by the people wouldn't perish from the earth. He redefined American democracy forever. With that moral compass firmly set, Lincoln finally found his fighters, Ulysses S. Grant and William T. Sherman. They unleashed a relentless, total war strategy. Sherman marched straight through Georgia, dismantling the Southern infrastructure, while Grant relentlessly cornered General Lee in Virginia. The terrible, swift sword of the Union was finally breaking the Confederacy's capacity and their will to wage war. Fast forward to his re-election and second inauguration in 1865. Victory is clearly in sight, but instead of taking a victory lap or demanding brutal punishment for the South, Lincoln steps up and delivers these stunning words. With malice toward none, with charity for all. He called for profound compassion, forgiveness, and national healing. He wanted to bind up the nation's wounds, not salt them. But man, the whiplash from triumph to tragedy was blindingly fast. April 9th, 1865, Lee surrenders at Appomattox. The war is effectively over, the Union is saved, but just 5 days later, on April 14th, Lincoln is assassinated at Ford's Theater. In less than a week, the nation experienced the ultimate high of saving the country and the devastating, unimaginable loss of the leader who did it. When you look back at it, Abraham Lincoln's legacy is simply monumental. He held a fractured nation together through sheer willpower and political genius. He set the irreversible stage for the 13th Amendment, forever abolishing slavery. He took a country founded on a deep contradiction and forced it to step closer to its highest ideals, becoming a global beacon for freedom in the process. Which really leaves us to ponder this final thought as we wrap up today's explainer. How does a democracy survive when its greatest test demands such a fragile, ultimate sacrifice? Lincoln's life absolutely proves that a single individual, armed with moral clarity and relentless perseverance, can change the course of history. But it also leaves us asking ourselves, what are we willing to endure today to keep that new birth of freedom alive?